the thing we're obsessed about is speed to insights. I think this is really, for me, one of the number one thing that drives me every time we do something is like, how can we get to the insights in a reliable fashion, but faster?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Signal and the Noise, a podcast dedicated to helping today's business leaders navigate the complexities of decision-making by leveraging data and groundbreaking technology, first and foremost AI. Today, we'll walk through the complexities of creating an authentic story and explore the connection between humans and machines. We'll discuss the importance of distinctiveness and how to effectively interact with your storylines to operationalize your insights in service of powerful marketing, communications, and risk mitigation. We'll dive deep into the framework through 3 key building blocks and address the pressing question of AI's importance and the exciting developments in this space. I'm Dan Gaynor. I'm on with my partner, Shann Biglione. We together lead strategic solutions, the insights division of Signal AI. Shann, welcome to the pod.
Well, nice to see you, Dan. You sound much better than I do on podcasts.
Thrilled to be here. I think you have more sophisticated electronic equipment, so hopefully it all evens out. We obviously know each other a long time. We have been in deep with AI, building different versions of insights for customers. Shann, I thought today it would be good for us to get a bit into our process and what it actually looks and feels like in a more tangible sense to test, deploy, and optimize a AI-powered measurement system that sharpens marketing and communications in service of strengthening reputation and mitigating risk. How does that sound for today?
Sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty good to me.
Fabulous. So, Shann, let's just start a little bit with your background, then maybe I'll do my background. It's always good to start with the human beings behind things. You've lived on, I think, every continent other than Antarctica. Let's start
in Africa.
there.
I've not lived in Africa. That's
Okay.
missing right now. Yeah. But yeah, no, I've been around. I started my career in digital marketing for movie studios, marketing movies like Finding Nemo, for instance, or Pirates of the Caribbean. And I've grown as a strategist basically in the advertising industry, and that took me to London, Los Angeles, Shanghai. I did some studies in Japan and whatnot. So yeah, I've been moving around, but I've been always obsessed with how we use intel, whether it's qualitative intel, quantitative intel, to help inform business decisions. And for me, whenever I thought about strategy is, for me, the core definition about deciding what not to do, and therefore how to use that data for this is very, very powerful. And you and I met about 3.5 years ago, I believe, basically trying to figure out what we'll do next after our agency experiences for a little bit of a while. And yeah, we set up Kelp. I mean, I'm sure you can tell that story, though.
We'll put this podcast in the time capsule for when AI-powered communications was invented. So yes, of course, I think we've spent more times on Zoom one-on-one together than any 2 people should. We, of course, co-founded Kelp together, which was acquired by Signal AI at this point 2 years ago. By way of my background, came to it from politics, started out in the Obama administration, served as an appointee in foreign policy, doing everything from public-private partnerships that got Coca-Cola to move not just cans of Coke, but vaccines to Africa, all the way through dealing with the Ebola epidemic and ensuring people that it wasn't going to be that bad. Over to Nike headquarters, where I helped start the Global Narrative Center of Excellence, working for their C-suite on everything from innovation to investor relations. Then over to Weber Shandwick, where I started a narrative strategy and analytics practice. Brought an idea to Shann around the idea of, could you index reputation? Shann, of course, famously said it was impossible, and then went on to build it. And in teaming up with Signal AI, we've seen that idea morph, shape, and accelerate in ways that we never could have foreseen. The rocket fuel that is the tech stack we're able to play around with every day is a real gift for communicators and a real fun sandbox for folks like us who like to build things. So Shann, let's talk a little bit about building. What are the core ingredients that any communicator, marketer, person looking to mitigate risk across the C-suite should be thinking about when it comes to creating a system that uses AI to help them strengthen reputation and also navigate around risk? What are the building blocks?
Well, there are really 3 building blocks at the core. One is a framework of the types of thematics that might influence your reputation. So topics in our world at Signal AI is a big thing. So we use AI to train topics and understand topics from immunotherapy to corporate governance to stock purchase prices and stuff like this. So understanding how which storylines are going to be making up your reputation is a very important part. And Dan, when we joined forces 3 years ago, your experience in the world of communications and how you're doing this at Nike and all those companies really was informing a lot of where the common blueprints between companies. So having a good framework is step one, knowing what matters in the conversation. The second thing is understand what type of KPIs do you want to measure within it. So great, we are measuring certain topics, certain companies, but what kind of numbers can we try to use in there, or what kind of qualitative measures can we use? And so, we play a lot with things like volume of coverage. We play with things like the sentiment of the coverage. Now, the beauty of Signal's data is that we're using sentiment at an entity level, which means that we can identify when the company's talked about negatively or positively in an article, not just get the sentiment of the overall article. The very first version we had of our product, if you remember, Dan, was giving us stuff where we had two companies basically suing each other, and the sentiment was the same for both, whether one was winning or not. So you had these issues. So having a sentiment at the entity level was a big thing for us. But volumes, sentiment, salience is another thing as well for us, trying to understand, are people really talking about the company or the person in this coverage can make a big difference. So understanding which KPIs at the core can help you build your system. And then the third part is always trying to understand, cool, we have KPIs independently, but how do we make them work together? What kind of scoring engines and maths can we try to apply to those KPIs to get an aggregate view of what's going on? And that scoring is as much about trying to understand how sentiment and salience and volumes, for instance, need to be weighted against one another. But also, if you're going to be talking about your different topics, what are the roles and the weights of each of those topics? We typically like to track about 100 topics per industry when we go track an entire industry. And so when you have 100 topics, you can't just take them all and say, oh, they all equal the same weight. They just don't. And something we see constantly in the data, the fact that topics can be much more talked about than others, or much more passionately talked about. And so how you weight those topics is another part of your scoring engine. So having the right framework, understanding which KPIs you use and how to marry those KPIs together into more benchmarking solutions is a really fantastic way to take a more data-driven version of what your reputation is.
Yeah, I love the way you put it. There's almost two key themes that underpin that, which are quality and structure, right? Mm-hmm. I can't tell you how often I talk to chief comms, chief marketing, chief whatever officers who say the same phrase. We're interested in doing more with less. We're interested in quality over quantity. And so what does that mean? When you talk about things like sentiment, right? Not looking just at the headline of a piece, but instead being able to discriminate whether or not in each individual phrase, that individual mention of an individual company was positive, negative, or neutral gets you to a far deeper level of accuracy. Same deal, of course, for salience, right? To what degree were there pieces of coverage where I was the feature versus I was the bullet point? And we want to weight those more heavily. And then, of course, this gets into structure, right? You mentioned frameworks. I want to double click on this. To me, a narrative is a North Star for communications. It's these fewer, deeper storylines that we should consistently campaign on as an organization. And each of those storylines should be buffeted and made fresh again, renewed, if you will, by the proof points from the business. So let's talk a little bit about taking those raw ingredients and structuring them into a framework that allows us to, on an apples to apples basis, measure reputation, but also allow us to detect emerging risks. We can go bounce it back and forth here, but Shan, just tell me, when you were trying to compare industry across industry, as presented in the Signal 500, how do you wrap your head around comparing a vertical like manufacturing to one like renewable energy, to big tech and automotive and everything in between?
It's hard. And so the Signal 500 that you're talking about, so for the listeners, is available on the website. If you go to signal-ai.com, you'll be able to find at the top navigation bar the Signal AI 500. These are 500 of the most talked about companies in the world across 24 industries. And you have access to these public benchmarks based on the entire data set of Signal AI, where we rank them and show the evolution that they have within it. And now to your question about how do you compare them? Well, you need some sort of universality between them. There are, and you tell that story really well, innovation means different things for Nike than it does for Pfizer. There's just going to be very different topics in here. And so how do you score the innovation between two industries is complicated. And so one of the big things we've done, and this is in great part thanks to you, Dan, is this idea that there are universal storylines that do matter for organizations. The ones we have selected when we built our frameworks were around companies, generally speaking. There are nuances, but they like to be seen as innovative. They like to be seen as good for the world and the environment, purposeful in our world. And they like to be seen as people who make money. They have performance, they're well operated and whatnot. This is kind of a very standard thing. And I remember when we first brainstormed all of this, it was very interesting to see how much all the clients we've serviced, and you've worked across many industries, I have too, there really was that real need across these universal storylines. I even remember one meeting where we were brainstorming before we funded the business, and it was just coming off a meeting with one of my customers who was literally talking about purpose, innovation, performance are really important things. Like, dude, we really have something here, right? And so having universal narratives does matter because you need some points of reference that they can go and compare them with one another. So purpose, innovation, performance, what could fall under those? How much those topics are talked about is where we spend a lot of time when we create things like the Single Eye 500. As I said, usually when you have an industry, we have about 100 topics within it. When we look at the Single Eye 500, we're closer to 300 topics because we are aggregating quite a few different industries within it. And so to create this comparison, we have this universality is ultimately letting us at the higher level, the higher order, the pillars, so innovation, purpose, performance, and some of the key themes beyond those, to create comparisons between those companies. But what I find personally very interesting when we look at those insights is, yes, you can see how Apple compares to Nike. You can. And it's giving an indication. But it's also very interesting to then measure how their own industries are comparing one another. Because there are truth and realities where an industry is more expected to be innovative, like tech, than another, like FMCG. So it is expected to see tech being overperforming on innovation versus the FMCG world. And so that aspect of understanding the trend lines within industries is the extra piece of data we like to use to be able to then compare apples to apples.
I think for me, it's all about one word, which is differentiation, right? To what degree can we differentiate from three different elements? From ourselves, right? From the same messaging, the same rote commentary that we continue to push out over and over again. I remember being at Nike, and every time we had a new shoe to announce, we would joke internally, it was the fastest shoe ever. And by definition, it was the fastest shoe ever. It was the next model of the LeBron James 15 and then 16 and then eventually 21. But you can't tell that message the exact same way over and over. So how do we differentiate from our own gobbledygook? That's one. To your point, how do we differentiate from our industry peers? So for example, in the world of life sciences, what company doesn't say we put patients first, right? What company doesn't say we embrace health equity and access to medicine? Everybody says that. It's a sea of sameness. And then to your point, in a world where narratives are themselves competitive territories, where everyone is competing on the race to get to net zero, and everyone wants to be an employer of choice and a leader on diversity and inclusion, and everyone wants to be this AI-powered R&D engine, how can we tell storylines that truly only we authentically can own?
It is hard. Do you have an answer to this? Because you've been in the weeds of trying to do some of that.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the raw ingredients. We've talked about frameworking those ingredients so that you can scan the horizon, both within your industry and across industries. But let's talk about implementation, which is, in my view, a good mix, a good marriage of the human and the machine together. Now, you and I both believe, I think, in the human in the loop, the ability for a sharp strategist to interpret some of the findings of AI and then operationalize them in an organization where you can inform your editorial calendar, do your channel planning, even budget off of it. Sometimes we've seen people's literal pay compensation get pegged to it. So I'll tell you my first step, and I want you to fill in here. My first step is downloading the key priorities. It could be narrative pillars. It could be the corporate strategy. It could be the ESG wins of the year into the system so that we're mapping our analysis to the right topics that matter most for that company and indeed across the industry. And I want you to fill in on something in particular, which is We've talked about apples to apples analysis, right? Comparing IBM to Tesla on renewable energy. But sometimes within an industry, you have very niche topics. In pharma, it's cell therapy and gene therapy. In manufacturing, it might be automation and AI-powered quality assurance. In sports, it might be using algae to create shoelaces. I'd be very interested in how you then customize the system to capture the nuances that are particular to very complicated industries.
Well, first of all, you have to know which ones matter. And to your point, knowing that laser weapons matter for the defense industry is part of the thing. So we always spend, before we ever consider building an industry index, we always spend a healthy amount of time with experts in those fields, people who are really in the weeds and know what gets talked about. Because then you can go and say, oh, well, cool, these are things that we want to train an AI around. And we want you, Mrs. AI, to go and understand what laser weapons are about, or as we have done, what immunotherapy is about, why CAR T cells matter when we talk about immunotherapy and things like that. So just to try to get to that understanding of the topic. And one of the big things for us is we don't necessarily use Boolean keywords. We don't just say like, oh, if there is the word immunotherapy, it's it. Because it's not. And many times there's lots of nuances. So to have an AI to understand the concepts behind it and to train it is a big, big foundation to get to more accurate results. Now, we talk of a universality across industries, but then we're now touching into more the universality within industries, which is another layer. One of the most common things we know about companies, they tend to build distinctiveness between themselves, and they tend to define the world in somewhat custom ways. We worked across quite a few customers together, and the truth is that they feel like this term is how we like to think of things. And that's great. This is fantastic. Does that mean it's the way the world thinks of it? Not always. And finding the common threads within an industry is a big part of the exercise. I would never advise training a topic that is only ever going to be true for a single company. You're starting to talk about a comms spin in most cases. You're not really talking about something that is a shared concept between companies. So shared concepts between companies is a very important part. And I love that personally, because as a strategist, one of the most common mistakes I have seen from companies is they basically put blinds and they just start kind of thinking about the narrow view of how they define the world. And there's an entire thing happening outside, and you need to sense things. We talk a lot at Signal between tracking things we know about and sensing things we might not know about. Sensing is a big part of uncovering interesting stuff and talking about it in ways your competitors might talk about it, your consumers or customers will be understanding it. It does matter to get to that effect, in my experience.
I mean, going back to the point on differentiation, if you want to differentiate from your competitors, in other words, you need to differentiate between the messaging that really just matters to you and is a big flat thud in the marketplace versus the messaging that would really resonate with you owning, leading authentically a given topic, right? And that might be a new branch of medicine. In defense, that might be sensor fusion and digital interoperability. And in the entertainment industry, it might be AI-powered user-generated content. Whatever it might be, your point being, let's use the system to understand the best possible vehicle to establish thought leadership on that given frame, frame.
And then, to your point, how you talk about it is where you can really build what I'm going to call more distinctiveness and differentiation. It's one thing in marketing, the terms, there's a lot of debate, right? Well, there've been a lot of debates over the past decade between distinctiveness and differentiation. I'm going to nerd out for a second here. But basically the idea is that, we have built, the Kotlers of this world have this thing, this differentiated brands do better. And what we find is brands are not necessarily as differentiated as we think. Adidas and Nike, it's not like there's huge difference. They both have good shoes that can help you dunk or run or whatever. But ultimately distinctiveness, like knowing the visual universe. The pursuit of differentiation, I think, is very, very important, but that's very often tied to very intrinsic values of your company. Like, for instance, a Japanese company might have more credits or credentials to go talk about technology than something coming from another country. And the same way, luxury brands do this a lot, for instance. Or because you are a big investor in AI as Google, for you to be talking about AI, you'll be more differentiating around this than a company that's been producing chocolate, for instance, for example. So having it tied back to what you really do and who you are intrinsically is going to be driving a bit more of the differentiation tactic. But the beauty of it is being differentiated does make a difference, if I dare make a pun here. But being distinctive is where you really, really win from a communications perspective. And this is why there's many companies that are in not fully differentiated markets, but still kind of really carve out their own space. And I sometimes find as someone who worked in advertising, did a lot of work with creatives, I think it's very important to understand from the data where to play. The how to play is where also the magic happens. The how you bring that to life with the gusto that a Nike does is also a very, very important part of the equation.
Let's talk about the how to play element there. In our process overview here, we've talked about the raw ingredients, right? From topics to key metrics like sentiment and salience. We've talked about frameworking them both across industries, the Signal AI 500. We then double click within an industry to train specific topics, look at specific competitive sets within a given industry. Sometimes it might not even be your peer companies. It might be your peer business units. Mm-hmm. So just a division of a company versus a division of another company. But let's talk about the actual delivery of these insights. If you're a communicator, if you're a marketer, let's talk about the best way to use them. We deliver insights in two key ways. We deliver insights in terms of both reports and automated dashboards. Let's just talk about the human utility for a second, and I'll jump in, which are, we find that it's very important to have an ongoing sensing engine to track key storylines that we know will matter over time. But you said something very interesting, Shan, which I want to double click on, which is understanding if there are emerging topics, whether those are great opportunities or emerging risks that pop up out of nowhere, that weren't in our line of sight, that we might want to both capitalize on because no one is capitalizing on this white space, or mitigate because it's an iceberg that's affected some of our peers. So talk in particular, I'd be interested in how we slice up the analysis into use cases like white spaces, mm-hmm. velocity topics, or landmine topics that are the blinking red light haunting our dreams.
It's always fun when we start the engagement with a customer because there are things that do care about, and they're just like the company, the CEO cares about it. It's things that we know we've identified key topics to discuss as a business, and we'll try to own. And so the calculations and the math we put behind those things you've mentioned, like velocity, white spaces, landmines, these are things to try to help us figure out, okay, what is going on right now that we may not be paying attention to? So a white space is something where we say, there's not a lot of chatter, but there's not a lot of ownership either, and there's a lot of positivity behind those things. These are topics that right now are kind of signifying that if they're scaled bigger, could potentially be good things for you to stand out in the marketplace. The landmines are things where we see like, ooh, there's an increase in negativity. They might not have been negative, very strong negativity at first, but they're topics that we're seeing a trend that telling us like, there's a bit of a drift going on here, and the market is not responding to those super well. Velocity is things where we talk about, look, we're seeing a trend right now, not in negative sentiment, but in positive or neutral sentiment, where month over month, quarter over quarter, there's a growth coming, which means it's a hot topic. It doesn't mean it's always super positive, but it is something going on here. And those topics are really interesting for us because they very often help the communications teams to kind of like, interesting. It does not mean that you have to put all your bets onto this. It doesn't even mean you need to make these new things the new pillars. But sometimes it means as simply as, well, maybe there's ways for you to weave those into the core pillars that you are operating on, the ones that you want to be talking about. And so I think that aspect of understanding what is happening granularly, but through those tides that are shifting your entire industry, is very liberating and actually quite, for me, enthralling when we uncover those things. I know we've been on calls with customers where like, presenting white spaces, and they're like, 2 or 3 days later, like, this is now the headline of the Financial Times. How like, well, yeah, because we see some of those things kind of uncovered.
Absolutely. It just to reframe what you're saying, it's not enough to know what's going on. For the insights to be actionable, for you to really operationalize these findings, you need to know how to interact with those storylines. What are their use cases? And from there, right, very talented communicators can run with those. Okay, if we know there's an emerging crisis, what proof points do we have to show that we're not contributing to it, let alone vulnerable to it? If there's an area of opportunity, like a white space, okay, can we dig into our editorial hopper and find that story about using AI to diversify clinical trials that would allow us to establish a win? It's very funny. We work a lot in the healthcare industry, and we called out a very, very niche thing one time around a technology called antibody drug conjugates, which, to be honest, was the first time I had heard of it. They're like the Trojan horse of chemotherapy. The full 2 months after we presented insights around this industry, Pfizer acquired CGen for, I think, $38 billion, one of the biggest acquisitions of the year. That happens all the time, whether working in the entertainment industry, the tech industry, the healthcare, the defense industry. And I guess I just want to get a little bit into the then activities from it. You obviously, even in your previous career as chief strategist at Publicis, led some really big accounts that were well resourced. I have a few ideas on this, but to go to you first, what is the best structure for operationalizing these insights instead of it just being a cool thing, a great Economist article we read, into quite literally like our automated action plan?
Well, I mean, I think there's a cultural question first and foremost within the teams we service. I think the way we provide those is, of course, make sure you provide them in an intelligible fashion that can be shared and understood by a wider set. But culturally, there needs to be a reception for that. And that's, for me, it's in most companies, I think, most companies fail to succeed in those types of questions because they have the culture to welcome it. I have seen, I'm not going to name names, but I've seen customers who sometimes feel like, what do I do with this? I've not trained my team to think this way. How do I do that? So sometimes we spend a bit of time trying to educate that process a little bit. But that aspect of culture, for me, comes from the people at the top. It trickles down a lot. Like, is there curiosity in the business try to explore those things? And for us, in terms of how we like to present this, we are obsessed with, are we providing things in the best possible format? You've talked about dashboard, for instance. We try to build visuals that are intuitive and that can speak to people who are not necessarily day in and day out analysts all the time. The reports that we create, we're making sure that the reports we have are very clear on what the key takeaway is. I always, one of the pet peeves is whenever you see a slide and you're just like, so what is the key things? Like, if it's not in your headline, you kind of miss the mark. You need to be able to kind of read through the headlines and kind of get the sense of the executive summary of it. And so spending the time to make sure that those formats are easy for people to grasp and share is something we spend a hell of a time on. Newsletters, same thing, make sure they're well editorialized when we send newsletters and updates on a daily basis on what's happening in certain topics and industries. So that would be me as a product-centric part of our equation between you and I. These are the things that I tend to obsess over, is this kind of, how do you make it intelligible and how you make it basically more jargon-free and able to be shared and passed across so they can influence the culture. What are your takes there?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is having multiple layers of complexity. So to start with something incredibly simple, to your point, a reputation score that integrates every data point and every metric into a single number, a thermometer, if you will, to give us a sense of direction. How are we doing? To break that down into increasingly more specific levels of granularity. So a dashboard can take you pretty far, right? It can break down key pillars, it can break down key topics, it can do it by individual companies, it can do it over time, it can even do it by region. That's pretty helpful for a broad degree of communications needs. But when it gets to something that's truly C-suite level, we do find that having a human strategist in the loop, whether it's on your team or on our team, and ideally on both of our teams, to actually say, okay, now we're going to rip out this insight and we're going to run with it, and it's going to inform our strategy at this conference. Or it's going to help us determine whether we're going to spend a $10 million spend on this ad campaign, or it's going to help us figure out the right swim lanes for our C-suites. For me, operationalizing the insights is about, exactly as you said, having a culture where we're all taking the pieces relevant to our individual lines of business, whether that's a therapeutic area or an executive who we're helping with C-suite communications, and then making sure that we are translating that insight through our own expertise on the company and the industry through the channels that we think will naturally be the best delivery mechanisms. It isn't always about just taking this message, copy, paste, and putting it out on Twitter. It's about using your intellect to say, what would be, say, the 3 ways I could get this story out to the world?
So I do have a question for you here as the expert in how you activate on those things. When people think of PR departments outside of communication circle, they think like, oh, they do press releases. And I know it is one of the channels, but once you have stories to go tell, I mean, when we do a lot of work around executive comms and, social and PR and press releases and whatnot, can you tell me a little bit more about the types of things that a comms specialist usually have in the toolbox to go and play with? And has this changed for you since you've seen us informing people with some of the data stuff of the past few years?
I would say my topic sentence here is either you shape your narrative or the marketplace will shape it for you, right? There is no world in which you're able to operate super high quality whenever you want in the Wall Street Journal, and then the other time you're able to just sort of bubble up behind the scenes. So when it comes to a communications function of the future, I think there's three core elements. First is to be data-driven, right? To have an always-on horizon scan that complements your well-thought sense of intuition, so that we've constantly got a pulse check, whether that's daily dashboards, monthly reports, quarterly reputation scans, you name it. Being data-driven is essential. The second is to be more aggressive, right? We see that in this very, very vibrant media ecosystem, it isn't enough to just shoot for one big feature per quarter in elite publications, because as you know, Shan, reputation can come from anywhere. I remember early on you asking a question, which is, should we weight certain publications? Should the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times matter more than a local newspaper? And what we've seen is that reputation can be a positive or negative contagion, and it can come from the deepest, darkest corners. It can get picked up and translate from anywhere. So that's the second thing, being more aggressive. And then the third, I think, is really making sure that not only do you have a consistent narrative, but everything that you are putting out aligns to that narrative. It is so important to be consistent and make sure you connect the tissue between a M&A deal, an innovation announcement, a quarterly earnings call, a CSR philanthropic donation to the consistent pillars that you've always stood for. And then, by the way, rinse and repeat. Imagine this as a circle. Data on the front end, what should we take our bet on? Data on the back end, what worked? And then consistently optimize. And that's true, I think, across all channels. By the way, I would assume marketing as well.
Yeah, it's very similar in marketing as well. And the aspect of single-mindedness does matter. It is extremely hard for a message to cut through. We know that. And I've been playing with sometimes billions of dollars in ad spend to be able to get a message to cut through. And even then, sometimes it's hard. So we don't have naturally people's attention is the reality of corporations. One of the most common insights we see in our data system is that corporations are very often a very small part of the conversation. It's just not the way people think about the world, unless they have a real beef with one or it's just a strong passion for it. And so, like for us to fit into those conversations and to be part of it as corporations, we have to understand how to deserve that attention. And it's not just about what you want to say.
And by the way, we've seen that nowhere is that more true, I should say, than when we use our AI to analyze the AI discussion.
Yeah.
Right? There are these multi-billion-dollar mammoth battles for shaping the future of AI, and yet it's folks like Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, or Rishi Sunak, the PM of the UK, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And that's just true because we, interact with human beings. C-suites are the personification of their company's strategy. And so what's the most authentic way to get your message across? I think first and foremost should be the top box on your checklist. Now, Shan, there was no question that we were going to get to time. We've certainly almost gotten there. So I just want to round out with one more question, which is, what do you think the future of measurement looks like? So often we talk about AI in terms of generative AI, its ability to create new songs and create new images and write your wife a haiku. But I would be interested in the intersection of Gen AI and discriminative AI and where we see this industry moving. You play around with the product and you see some very cool things on the beta floor, so to speak. If we were to go into your software shop, what are sort of the exciting widgets that you think will be making headlines in a year?
Well, for sure, generative AI has had a big impact on the AI industry. And the thing with generative AI, it is not perfect either. The concept of generative AI is partly to make stuff up. It's why it's very popular with the creatives, and it's been well known in the concept of hallucinations, for example. So there's a lot of very exciting developments there. And what I think is really important to do when we talk of measurement is to understand how all those tools within AI can coexist and operate with one another. We have expertise in discriminative AI. We have expertise in generative AI. We talk about things like RAG. There is quite a few different techniques and technologies at the moment. Even generative AI itself has multiple cultures within it. There's people who approach it much more open source, closed source. There's a lot of different tools to play with. And so I think what we're seeing right now is, directionally speaking, the thing we're obsessed about is speed to insights. I think this is really, for me, one of the number one thing that drives me every time we do something is like, how can we get to the insights in a reliable fashion, but faster? There used to be a time where you had to compute and just literally in the world of comms, actually, let's go and count every page of the magazine, see where we are. It's like, we're way past that. Great. Now we can count things faster. But like, the question is like, okay, well, how is Nike performing on gender diversity? Question mark. We're in a stage where we'll be kind of able to ask that question and get an answer within a few seconds or minutes. Like, this is roughly what's happening with Nike and diversity and whatnot. And that speed to insight, I think, is one of the exciting bits. It's just ultimately, I think a lot of comms departments have sometimes struggled because the data part was intensive in terms of the amount of resources you had to invest into it to be able to extract real insights out of it. And so that aspect of making it much easier and faster to get this level of accuracy and understanding of what's going on is really, really valuable. And the reason it's valuable is simply because the world has exploded to an extent. There is content everywhere, as you said, and being in the Financial Times does matter. Don't get me wrong, it's a big deal. Lots of decision makers read the Financial Times, but there's a lot of noise going on out there, and it's very hard to control of that. We've created a world where the human mind cannot control what's going on, and even then, the human mind cannot measure what is happening. So we need those AI tools to help us do that. And that conflation of different trends, I think, in terms of where it's going, is extremely exciting. And that simplicity and direct, fast access to genuine insight that can be actionable is where all of this is going.
Because C-suites need context, right?
Always.
And that's the thing I think about all the time is decisions, of course, in a competitive industry, of which pretty much every industry we work in, quite very frankly, is. C-suites need context to understand because their decisions are going to have ripple effects across peers, across industry issues, across emerging innovations, you name it. And what I think is so powerful about the idea of speed to insight, the ability to surface insights by interacting with an AI system in natural language, is the ability to instantly download context that you would otherwise spend weeks to get to, so that you're able to make faster decisions that then capitalize on great storylines, areas of opportunity, but also help you navigate around that iceberg before it becomes a material threat to your business, right?
Yeah. It's very hard to quantify it, but the second most valuable resource for companies after money is time. And so making sure we can make sure that the time spectrum is as fast as possible is extremely valuable. And talking of time...
talking of time, I was going to say, I appreciate if anybody's listened to the full 36 minutes, I appreciate you spending the time with us. The best part of this is a peek into what's next for this podcast. Very rarely we'll have me and Shan talking at each other. More graciously, we'll have a chance to intersect with some of the top leaders in marketing and communications from some of the world's most sophisticated and interesting businesses. Like we said, this podcast, Signal in the Noise, is dedicated to helping today's business leaders navigate complexities of decision-making, help them leverage data and groundbreaking technology. And what will be really fun in future episodes is we will hear in very tangible terms how people like you and I are doing just that on behalf of some of the world's most important organizations. So with that, big shout out to the Signal AI marketing team led by Kayla for setting all this up. Shan, to you for being an amazing business partner and product guru that's made so many of these dreams come to life for so many people. And we're looking forward to having you all on for the next episode of Signal in the Noise.